Welcome to Forum. I'm Mina Kim. Speaker Mike Johnson says he'll shut down the House early for summer recess in an effort to head off Democrats' efforts to force votes on documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. The Speaker had already been trying to avoid voting on a non-binding Republican-led resolution demanding the release of more Epstein-related files. The disruptions to Congress, the questions about the president's connections to Jeffrey Epstein, and what information the government has on the convicted sex offender who worked with powerful people and trafficked teenage girls before his death, have continued to dog the administration for more than 2 weeks since the Department of Justice released a memo that angered the president's own base. We take a closer look at this moment when conspiracy theories are colliding with our nation's highest office and get your thoughts and questions. Joining me this hour, Ankush Khardori, senior writer at POLITICO Magazine and former federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice. Ankush, so glad to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Luke Broadwater, White House reporter for the New York Times. His recent articles include Trump talks about anything but Epstein on his social media account and inside the long friendship between Trump and Epstein. Luke, really glad to have you as well.
Thanks for having me.
So the Epstein saga, it has disrupted the work of the federal government for the second week now, and House Speaker Johnson is announcing the House will shut down early for its August recess. Luke, what is your reaction to all that?
Right. Well, this is the storyline that President Trump most hates, right? Since the beginning of his second term, he's been able to dominate the news cycle. At any time a storyline comes up that he doesn't like, he's able to quickly shift the topic to something else, right? There's a million things going on in the world. The Trump administration uses this so-called flood the zone approach where they do so many things so quickly that it's hard for the public and the news media to keep up with them. And so they're often able to switch the topic. But the Jeffrey Epstein files have dogged them now for more than 2 weeks. And the reason that is because the anger on this issue is coming from Trump's own base. It's not people who are upset about his hardline deportations or his hardline immigration policies. It's not people upset about the tariffs. This is Trump's own supporters, the people who helped put him into office, who badly want him to release more information about Jeffrey Epstein. And they feel insulted when the president says, move on. There's nothing to see here, folks. So they don't want to talk about it anymore. Anytime you ask an Epstein question to the White House, they say, why are you still asking about this? You can see Mike Johnson, the speaker, doesn't want to talk about it anymore. He's willing to shut down the House rather than take a vote on the Epstein matter. So this is the last thing the Trump administration and his political supporters in Washington want to be talking about at the moment.
So then do you think, given how lockstep the speaker and the president have been, that he played a role in Mike Johnson's call to essentially end housework early?
I mean, he could have. Mike Johnson's a smart guy. He probably didn't need a call from the president to shut this down. There's a discharge petition that Thomas Massie, a Republican from Kentucky, has filed that needs a certain number of legislative days to become active. And so if you cut off the legislative days, that shortens the time when that discharge petition can take effect. And that would, in effect, force a vote on releasing more information from the Epstein files. I should say the so-called Epstein files, because it really is a combination of different documents. Some people talk about grand jury testimony. Some people talk about witness statements. Some people talk about the administrative files in the possession of the FBI. So there's all sorts of things that could be released about the Epstein case. At its core, this is a terrible crime, and there was, in fact, a cover-up. Right? There was a cover-up of Jeffrey Epstein's actions early on in the law enforcement investigation. And so, it makes sense why people are angry about it and hungering for more and more information. Just at the moment, it's the president who is sort of standing in their way. And that's not a great storyline if you're a Republican.
So then let's step back for a minute and remind us who Jeffrey Epstein was, Luke.
Sure. Yeah. Jeffrey Epstein was a very wealthy financier from New York He, as best we can tell, he and Trump met when Epstein bought a property in Palm Beach, not too far from Mar-a-Lago. He and Trump were both sort of men about town in the 90s and 2000s. They were seen together at lots of parties, often surrounded by women. And eventually they have a falling out in 2004. Shortly after their falling out, police start to investigate Jeffrey Epstein. And what they find out is that over time, he has abused and will continue to abuse lots of young women and some underage girls, in fact. And, according to the FBI, the victims number in the hundreds, perhaps even more than 1,000. And at the same time, he's friends with and, socializing with sort of the world's rich and powerful, very, very famous people, very, very wealthy people, sort of, royalty from different countries. One of the victims of Epstein, accuses British royalty of being involved in the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. So you and none of these other people ever get charged, right? So the only people that go to jail in the end are Jeffrey Epstein and his former girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, who's still in prison now doing a 20-year sentence. And so and the early investigation, to add to that, there is a cover-up. Like I said, there's like a very shoddy police investigation. They agree not to go after other people. They shut down the FBI investigation at the time. And only because of investigative reporting from the Miami Herald is the case then sort of reinvestigated and recharged in 2019. And that's when Jeffrey Epstein hangs himself in jail. And so all this swirling sex crimes and rich and powerful people and the cover up lead people to want more information. And right now they're not getting that from the Trump administration.
Why did this grip MAGA in particular, though?
Sure. Well, one thing is that, Donald Trump and his allies have often played in the pool of conspiracy theories. And so Trump right away starts questioning whether, in fact, Epstein actually did kill himself. If you go online, there's all these, I would say baseless, no evidence of these conspiracy theories that Epstein was, a hit of Democrats, that Democrats had ordered him killed to cover up their terrible crimes. But, if you look into who associated with Epstein, it wasn't just Democrats. It was Democrats, Republicans, rich and powerful people from all different political stripes. The one thing that's never, no law enforcement investigation has ever proved is that there's credible evidence to charge anyone else beyond Epstein with abusing these girls and these women. And that's what the Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, said, was that, we reviewed the case files and we don't see any other actionable steps against other people that have been protected by the Justice Department. So there's not, some name in there of someone who was abusing girls and credible statements against them, and then that you could easily investigate and charge. So it may be that the thing that people most want, a client list, more men to go to jail, there isn't the evidence to support that.
Yeah, and that assessment from the Department of Justice really set off MAGA world. Talk about how President Trump handled that.
Right. I think Trump kind of sensed where this was going before most people, because as MAGA was so angry about this, Trump right away comes out and says, shut it down, essentially. Like, what's happening with my guys and gals, I think is his post. This is a hoax from the Democrats. He tries to shift the blame here about who's mad about these files, saying it's not really MAGA, it's the Democrats, and that the Democrats are coming for me, essentially, and that all this is going to lead to like more questions about me and my relationship with Epstein. And so there's nothing to see here. It's the latest Democrats hoax. And the Democrats hadn't even really gotten there yet. But after he starts to put that out there, they hop on it and are like, well, if he's so sensitive about this, he's we sort of smell there's a wound here that we can sort of pick at. And so then they start agitating in Congress to release more and more files. They're introducing amendments on the bills to release more files. They're doing everything they can because they sense a political weakness on Donald Trump's behalf. And frankly, the Democrats haven't had a lot to work with that's been sticking for them. They've been kind of in the political wilderness for a while. They lost the election very badly in terms of losing both chambers of Congress and the presidency. They have no levers of power. And finally, they have something that Trump is on his heels about. He's very worried about. They can attack him on, and public polling shows wide majorities of Americans want every single piece of evidence out there about Jeffrey Epstein. So they have the public on their side as well. So it's kind of an obvious political move here to hop on this and start demanding information. That said, I will say anybody who's ever worked with like a complex investigation knows that in files, there's all sorts of like shoddy evidence, right? There's hearsay, there's stuff that can't be substantiated, there's a witness statement who half understood something. And so you don't generally release all the files from everything because you can defame people, right? So you can put you can cast aspersions on someone's name and reputation when the evidence against them is really crappy and like shouldn't be out there in the public. So, and Trump did say early on he was worried about, sort of slandering innocent people in the process of releasing these files. So there are legitimate reasons not to release certain things. At the same time, that's not what the MAGA base wants to hear, that, this evidence isn't very good and therefore shouldn't be put out.
We're talking about the Jeffrey Epstein story and why it will not go away despite the administration's best efforts. And you, our listeners, are invited to join the conversation. What questions do you have about the resurgence of the Jeffrey Epstein story and the events of the past 2 weeks? Stay with us for more after the break. I'm Mina Kim. Welcome back to Forum. I'm Mina Kim. We're talking about the intensifying scrutiny on the Trump administration's handling of information about Jeffrey Epstein, the wealthy convicted sex offender found dead in his jail cell in 2019. It has disrupted the work of the GOP-led House as it avoids calls for votes on releasing more so-called Epstein files. We're talking about it with Luke Broadwater, White House reporter for the New York Times, and also with you, our listeners. What questions do you have about the resurgence of the Jeffrey Epstein story, the events of the past 2 weeks? What do you think the longer-term Epstein fallout will be? Do you think there will be accountability beyond what's happened? What do you think about how the Democrats are doing to use this moment? Should they, to their advantage or not? Email your comments and questions to forum@kqed.org. Find us on Discord, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads at KQED Forum, or call us at 866-733-6786, 866-733-6786. Ankush Khardori is senior writer at Politico Magazine and former federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice. And Ankush, I know we've been trying to sort out your connection. Wondering if you could share with us essentially what you think are 3 possible explanations for why the Department of Justice has handled the Jeffrey Epstein case in the way that it has and the uproar that has happened as a result of it.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've sort of thought about this sort of schematically, I think there are, as you said, sort of 3 broad scenarios we're dealing with. One is, that Trump and J.D. Vance and Kash Patel and all, the folks around them in recent years really believe that things that they were saying about how there might be more to investigate, how there might have been a cover-up, how there might be questions around Epstein's death, and now they've come into office and they've learned those things are not actually true. Their concerns were misplaced, and then now they're sort of scrambling to explain things. That, I think, is the most innocuous scenario we're dealing with. The second one is that, over the course of all these years, they were lying and sort of manipulating the public, sort of indulging their supporters' conspiracy theories to try to help advance their political interests and to facilitate Trump's return to office. And then the third, which is not exactly mutually exclusive at this point, is that, these folks may have believed this as they were coming in, believed in these things and that there might be more information to release. And lo and behold, they may have come across some reason to believe that Trump or allies of Trump may actually be represented more in the documents than they had believed. And we're seeing something akin to a cover-up. Now, I don't know that we're there yet. We haven't seen any direct evidence of a cover-up. But I would just say that, the way that Trump himself has approached this, is very out of step with how he's approached investigations in the past that are of interest to him. The idea that he only wants to release credible information, the idea that he only wants to release pertinent information from the grand jury testimony rather than dipping into the much larger universe of information that they do not need to go to a court to seek approval for the release of. And, these are qualifiers you tend not to hear from him. The notion that this stuff might be phony, as he put it in unprompted in a Fox interview last week, and that he's concerned about harm to third parties. He typically does not care about harm to third parties when a sort of fact pattern attracts his interest. And the thing I would say, as Luke said, this has now become part of their sort of argument for why they're constrained. We want to be safe about implicating third parties. I just have to say, the whole point of this exercise was for them to implicate third parties. That was the theory. Okay, so now to have them come in, right? The idea was that, okay, we haven't aired all this out. The government is covering stuff up. There's more people involved. So now the idea is, oh, no, we don't want to, point the finger at other people. It makes no sense. I mean, it's actually incoherent. So, I look at a situation like that, and I'm a lawyer. I'm temperamentally skeptical. Some of the things you could describe, including, for instance, Trump's effort to pin the blame on the Democrats, which is absurd, we would call, in the criminal justice system, a false exculpatory statement. And what happens when people give false exculpatory statements in the criminal justice system is that we assume that they are lying to cover up for themselves. So those are sort of the tools that I bring to bear here. And as we sketch out those, I don't want to put a thumb on the scale, but that's sort of how I think about it.
Right. I mean, as you say, let's be very clear. There is no direct evidence of an intentional cover-up on the part of Trump or the White House or the Department of Justice. But you, as a former federal prosecutor who specializes in financial fraud and white-collar crime and so on, are bringing that experience to bear in terms of what kinds of things in the way that Trump has responded that has raised some flags for you, it sounds like. And Luke, you touched on this, but you also reported more deeply on it. Can you just also mention the reason why it's hard for people not to give up the idea that there is some cover-up of Trump's involvement in this in some way because of their long history? What are some sort of key moments in their relationship that are, people are really focusing on? And also the reporting by your colleagues that has been put out by Maria Farmer as well, that are just causing people to continue to think this could be one of the reasons that the DOJ is acting this way.
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at what we do know from the Epstein files, that Donald Trump's name is in there, right? He's on the flight logs between Palm Beach and New York at least 7 times. So he flew on Epstein's private jet. He's been accused by multiple women that based on, I would say, sometimes there's a groping accusation where Epstein has brought a woman to Trump and Trump gropes her. There's another time Epstein brings a woman to Trump and he sort of eyes her up in her telling, and Epstein says, no, she's not for you. So there are evidence, and some of these people did talk to investigators. So I assume their statements are in files somewhere that would be released, that would have more, testimony and things against Trump. But look, these guys were friends for 15 years. They ran in the same circles. They would go to sort of Victoria's Secret parties together, cheerleader parties together. There's one gentleman who says he was asked to organize this party, and he had all these women come to it, and for Trump and Epstein are the only 2 guys that show up to it. And so you would hear testimony like that in these files. So there is stuff about Trump in there, I'm sure, right? We know that to be true. And so I think that when people hear he doesn't want to release certain things, he's worried about people's reputations being smeared, they think he's protecting himself. At the same time, Trump, during his campaigns, raised all these questions about Bill Clinton and said, well, why is Bill Clinton going to the private island with Epstein? And so he was happy to weaponize these files when it was in his political advantage during a campaign. And now that he actually has the power to order them to be released, he says he doesn't want to release anymore. So obviously that's going to raise questions for people.
Yeah, and now he's also suing the Wall Street Journal, Ankush, and I'd love to get your thoughts on that, basically for publishing a lewd birthday note that they claimed was from the president to Epstein in 2003. You know, what do you think of this incident, and also about the way the president has responded by suing the Wall Street Journal, and then more recently also barring them from the press pool for his trip to Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, look, the complaint itself is pretty weak on its face. The journal stories appears to be very carefully reported and lawyered. You can tell the language is carefully constructed in certain places. And, Trump has secured some settlements that have gotten a lot of attention from media outlets and litigation from ABC and CBS. Those tend to be exceptions, those. When Trump files a case against media outlets, and he's filed quite a few of them at this point, and they reach an actual judicial resolution, meaning a judge actually considers at some point, maybe at a motion to dismiss stage or whatever, he tends to lose. Because his cases tend to be quite weak. And I think if you look at this case, it does not appear to be particularly strong on its face. And, assuming Trump doesn't, they don't settle it, or Trump doesn't sort of voluntarily dismiss it at some point, which has happened in the past with other cases he's filed to avoid discovery, he will himself be exposed to answering questions from the Wall Street Journal's lawyers, not just about the letter, but his broader relationship with Epstein, going all the way back to whenever it first began. Because if you're the Journal's lawyers, you, among other things, would want to ask questions not just about Trump's involvement in the letter or lack thereof, but his potential motive to lie about having written the letter, if that is true. Now, he has vehemently denied it, but these are the sorts of questions you can expect him to face if this case actually proceeds to discovery, and you can also expect the Journal to ask for as many documents as possible from Trump himself. Now, as to the broader sort of implications of the lawsuit, I mean, it is a very unusual situation. We're used to Trump suing media outlets, but this is the first time, it seems, a sitting U.S. president has sued a media outlet, and it is about reporting that concerns his time in office, and an issue that has been elevated to intense public interest by the president and by the president's allies. So the notion that he can go out now and try to sue the Wall Street Journal, he's asking for $20 billion. That's kind of absurd number on its face. But, it does have a potential deterrent effect on other outlets. Not that there are outlets like the Journal, the Times, Politico, on and on and on, that have good lawyers. They're in positions to defend themselves from lawsuits like this. But if you're one level beneath that, you now have to be thinking, well, if I file something unflattering about Trump, is he going to file some lawsuit that could decimate the company in the worst case scenario?
Let me go to some audience questions. Let's go to Frank in Mill Valley. Hi, Frank, you're on.
Thank you. I was going to ask about, don't the passenger manifests constitute the client list that everybody's yapping about, and how much discovery's been done on it? But your comment makes it sound like those lists are out there. And as a prosecutor, wouldn't you expect to see in the follow-up investigation questions about the trips and what happened?
Luke, you want to take that?
That's not going to come out that's not going to come out in the grand jury stuff.
Right, the grand jury stuff. So, Luke, you want to take Frank and also just remind us what the Trump administration has done to try to respond and maybe try to satisfy its base with regard to more information?
Sure. So obviously there were a couple criminal prosecutions about this matter, and so a lot of information came out during those prosecutions. And what the Trump administration did to try to satisfy the base was they released something they called the Epstein Files Part 1. And so in that cache of documents are the flight logs, but those had already been introduced in court already. So that wasn't anything new. And I think they thought that would satisfy people, but they really just put out information that was already in the public domain that reporters had already seen and written about, much of which was already online. And so it didn't satisfy people at all. Now, you ask about the client list. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, says that there is no client list. In the FBI's possession, they couldn't find one. They don't possess one. What we do have is sort of his contact book, which is a bunch of names of people and phone numbers. And, does that mean that that person was involved in criminality? Of course not, right? Just because you have somebody's phone number or have their name written down doesn't mean that they were, abusing underage girls, right? So you can't just being on the plane with Epstein or just being in his book is not evidence of a crime. And so from there, I mean, I guess you could go down and question every single person on those lists and so forth. And maybe the FBI has done that. I don't know the extent of their investigation, but, just knowing somebody is not a crime, of course.
So with regard to the grand jury testimony that the DOJ has ordered a court to unseal, would that provide information, you think, Ankush, that would satisfy what it seems is particularly the MAGA base is clamoring for?
No, it will not even come close. I don't want to bore your listeners with the mechanics of grand jury, but I will just say this. The criminal investigative process to the point of charging works like a funnel, right? So you are gathering an extraordinary amount of information. Luke is exactly right. There's lots of names of people. Those might be leads, right? You might go and interview those people or ask questions about those people. And honestly, that seems to be the thing that Trump supporters are interested in, the raw investigative material. At the point in which you get to charging a criminal case and are putting in grand jury testimony, two things. One, it will be targeted to the charges that you are actually bringing. You are not going to be putting in irrelevant information that you do not intend to introduce at trial, right? So if something didn't come at trial, you could fairly assume that it's not going to be the subject of intense grand jury testimony. And two, the number of witnesses that the government might even put in to testify in a grand jury can vary widely. And again, I don't want to bore you with the details, but it can be one or two people, depending on how you construct the case. Sometimes if you have a recalcitrant witness, you might put them into the grand jury and then ask them sort of a wide-ranging questions. But for the most part, particularly in large, complex investigations where the people who are of interest to the government are well-resourced and have money, they try to avoid going to grand juries, and they prefer what are known as government proffers, which are interviews with the government. And those are not going to be in the grand jury testimony. Those are going to be memorialized in FBI 302 reports of those interviews. And here, too, I think that is what Trump's base really is looking for, not this very narrowly targeted segment of information that may or may not shake loose out of this process.
And the White House has also said it's going to subpoena Ghislaine Maxwell, who, of course, is serving a 20-year sentence for sort of aiding Jeffrey Epstein. What do you think that's all about, Ankush?
I mean, honestly, it doesn't make much sense, except that they want to be taking public steps that they can point to sort of demonstrate that they're actually trying to do something. I mean, the notion that they would go to now Maxwell and at this late date, as Luke said, Epstein died in 2019, and try to effectively redo the investigation or to redo elements of the investigation, it's highly strange and highly unlikely to generate any credible information that the government would actually be able to act upon. I think this is, frankly, a bit of a waste of time on the merits, and I don't quite get it. I mean, they seem to be deliberately going, using these channels or talking about these mechanisms, the grand jury, or talking to Ghislaine Maxwell, where they do not have control over the outcome. And that seems to be intentional. So they can kind of point to, oh, Maxwell didn't have anything to say. The court wouldn't give us the grand jury testimony. Well, 99% of the information, I'm just roughly speaking, that is in the government's files is not with Maxwell or in the grand jury testimony.
Let me go to caller Noreen in Oakland. Hi, Noreen, you're on.
Good morning.
Good morning. Go right ahead.
It is adorable, Mina, to watch your articulate, intelligent, beautiful self say, so what do you think of this? I'm watching Trump now wanting to rebrand football teams to possibly take our mind off of this for a minute. But I don't think MAGA, I think they're enjoying this like a fraternity brothers thing. I think they're enjoying hearing that he's associated with this, and they're almost vicariously living through his ability to go backstage in a beauty pageant and investigate naked women.
Let me get Luke's thoughts on what you're saying, Noreen, there too, because also Anyway, go ahead, Luke. But there's been some reporting that, this Wall Street Journal event as well has sort of rallied MAGA back behind Trump as well. Anyway, do you think that ultimately MAGA just likes the chaos, as Noreen is suggesting, and also some of the more lewd aspects of this?
Obviously Trump's political move here is to give MAGA an enemy and redirect their anger towards someone else, right? And so with the Wall Street Journal story, this gave him a familiar foe, which is the mainstream media. And so he filed a suit. He can sort of redirect them. Those are the bad guys. Don't be mad at me and my administration. Leave poor Pam Bondi alone and go after those liars and the fake news. I think the same thing he's doing with the motion in New York as well, where he's trying to release ask a judge to release the grand jury testimony. Or
Luke, we'll continue this right after the break. This is Forum. I'm Mina Kim. Welcome back to Forum. I'm Mina Kim. We're talking about how the Jeffrey Epstein story has disrupted the federal government. It has disrupted the work of the GOP-led House as it avoids calls for votes on releasing more so-called Epstein files. We're taking a closer look at what happens when conspiracy theories collide with our nation's highest office and what it all means, how we got here, and what the impacts are on all of us. And we're taking your specific questions on this story and its resurgence, your thoughts on how our government is handling it, how Republicans are handling it, how Democrats are handling it, and what you make of this moment. You can email forum@kqed.org, find us on Discord, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads at KQED Forum, or call us at 866-733-6786, 866-733-6786. And a little bit related to Noreen before the break, Luke, Joan asks, is the MAGA-based outrage over Jeffrey Epstein a blip or the beginning of the end for Trump? It seems to me this outrage over Epstein is just a blip, and why is it taking place? And I think that is one of the questions. Like, this president who has famously been able to weather controversy, storms, redirect his base or explain things to his base in a way that satisfies them or brings them back on board, has been the way that he's operated. Is this, do you think, a moment when, given everything that we've just seen, that may not happen?
Yeah. This is a projection, but I tend to agree that MAGA never really blames Trump personally for anything. Trump famously said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and wouldn't lose any supporters, and that's been pretty much true. That doesn't mean they're not pissed off about the Epstein files. That doesn't mean they're not pissed off about being told that there's nothing to see here and to look elsewhere. I think a lot of, if you talk to any Trump supporters that you know in your family or in your life, they're mad about this, and they don't like being told there's nothing to see here. They think there's disgusting crimes that are being covered up, and why are you telling us to look away? That said, I think it's much more likely they'll end up, at the end of the day, ultimately blaming Pam Bondi or a judge or Democrats in Congress or anyone else but Trump. Most Trump supporters you talk to will contort the facts to fit a worldview in which Trump is right. And so they will do whatever they can to get that outcome. And I do think on balance, Trump supporters, even if they hate the way this is going with the Epstein files, generally like the things he's doing. And so they will say, well, 9 out of 10 isn't bad.
Well, this listener, Abby, writes, is anyone considering that all this Epstein stuff is a distraction from people starving and being killed in Gaza, from people dying in Ukraine, from the destruction of our government, from the fact that Americans and immigrants are being kidnapped, which we just talked about yesterday? Of course, Ankush, I want to get your thoughts on what Abby is saying here, and what, if you don't think that they're deliberately trying to create a distraction from bigger issues and they're finding themselves embroiled in something they didn't want, what this tells you about the competency of our senior officials, our most senior officials in our country.
There's absolutely no question that there are many, many more important things and consequential and substantive things, including all the things that your listener just identified. I wholly agree. This is a very strange situation that has been thrust upon us by Trump himself and by his political allies. And it is in capturing people's attention because It is a very strange set of facts. And there's been such a push on the political right to move this forward. So in that sense, I don't think it's a distraction. I mean, I don't think they intentionally did this to distract from the other things. They may be fine with that. I don't know. But I don't think they wanted to be embroiled in this. It looks like they wanted to get out from under it as quickly as possible. That's why we saw a very terse joint DOJ FBI memo that they thought would put this to bed, and it didn't, and that's why we're still here. In terms of what it says about the Justice Department leadership, it says nothing good. It says nothing good. As I said, there are a few different scenarios, but even the most innocuous scenario, if we assume that they were honestly mistaken in their views about what the government did, and I'm not prepared to assume that, but let's assume that they were honestly mistaken. They have been engulfed by their own mistakes for weeks now. I mean, the idea that the Deputy Attorney General might fly to go interview Ghislaine Maxwell about someone who died 6 years ago in a criminal investigation that's been closed for years, it is an extraordinary waste of his time. And it is an extraordinary waste of the Justice Department's time and resources. And yet, it is clearly occupying the highest echelons of the DOJ and FBI on a near daily basis for weeks. So it's a mess. It does not say anything good about the leadership of DOJ. And of course, the worst case scenarios, the worst scenarios that they lied or that they're covering something up are even worse.
You've been raising concerns also about what this means if they had to handle a real incredible national crisis or law enforcement crisis. What did you have in mind when you were thinking that?
To even think about these things, but of course we have to. The country we've been the target of a major terrorist attack before, right? 9/11. We have huge threats on the cyber front that could, from all sorts of countries that could do all sorts of damage, and those are things that need to be occupying the attention of the FBI on a near daily basis. That is what we expect them to do to protect us. And so the idea that they're now focused on these other things is really striking to me. And it's just like it's a real misallocation of resources, but they created it themselves. And now they've created this expectation, as Luke was talking about, among a certain class of people that they will do something more. But it's been really striking the way that they've been fumbling around. They can't, Pam Bondi can't just get in front of a microphone and give a coherent explanation of what's going on. They look evasive. They look distracted. They look embarrassed. And this is a crisis of their own making. This is a crisis of their own making. And they selected the time in which it would begin because they got to choose when they would release that memo. So what happens when something that they didn't create and didn't expect arrives?
This listener writes on Discord, if the full Epstein files are released and no new or incriminating information emerges, how do Democrats plan to respond to potential criticism that they push for transparency only to fuel a political spectacle? Will the right claim it was all a distraction or a stunt? Luke, what do you think? Do you think the Democrats are taking risks here and would take that blame if that is what came to pass?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's Congress. Politics is at least half sport in Congress, and that's probably a low estimation. There's a bunch of people in Congress who operate on principle and a set of guiding values, but for the most part, it's a lot about getting wins and losses. And right now, they see the Republicans losing badly on this issue. I doubt any Democrat started this year thinking we're going to make a big deal about Jeffrey Epstein. They see weakness here, and so they're going to continue to hammer them. And if to the extent they can paint Trump as covering up for a sex offender, they probably think that they can gain some political gain there. At the same time, right? You only have certain hours in the day, right? And so every minute you're talking about Jeffrey Epstein, you're not talking about cuts to Medicaid or veterans health care or any other very important issue in the country. So they are making a decision, and frankly, it's because they see weakness. They see weakness on this issue in ways that they haven't on many, many other issues.
Again, we're talking with Luke Broadwater, White House reporter for the New York Times, co-author of the book with the Times, Annie Carney, Madhouse, How Donald Trump, MAGA, Mean Girls, a former used car salesman, a Florida Nepo baby, and a man with rats in his walls broke Congress. We're also talking with Ankush Khardori, senior writer for Politico Magazine and former federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice. His recent articles include Political Playbook, Trump's Epstein Evolution, and 3 scenarios that explain the Epstein debacle. And you, our listeners, are joining the conversation at 866-733-6786, at the email address forum@kqed.org, on Discord, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads at KQED Forum. Chloe on Discord writes, the MAGA base shouted from the rooftops about Epstein and his alleged ties with Bill Clinton. Kash Patel was one of the loudest voices asking to release the files. And of course, now Kash Patel is the head of the FBI and probably played a big role in the DOJ memo. Stephen writes, Trump is definitely acting guilty, but if there were incriminating evidence in the Epstein files, why would the Biden administration not have taken action? There are 2 possibilities. There was not enough evidence, or there was other people there were other people they were protecting. At this point, I think the public has the right to know everything. Ankush, what do you think about what Stephen is saying here?
Look, there is that is possible, right? That is possible. There is a third possibility, though, which is that the Biden Justice Department did the appropriate thing with a closed criminal case and did not go rooting around and releasing information from it that would hurt Biden's political opponent. That is not something we should want them to have done or to expect our leaders to do. Now, maybe it's something that Trump might do. Maybe it's something that even Biden might. I don't know. But the idea that, like, oh, shouldn't we have expected the last president to leak derogatory information that might link him to a child sex offender? I mean, no, we should not just expect that.
What about the chances that Democrats were involved in all of this, and that's why Biden didn't do it?
That's very possible. I mean, Clinton's in the documents. I mean, that's all of these things are possible. Clinton's in the documents. I'm sure Trump is in a bunch of the material for the reasons that Luke identified. So yes, there certainly could be. This is a bipartisan issue, but I will say, based on what we know, and particularly the Times is reporting and the Journal's reporting in recent weeks, Trump's relationship connections to Epstein go deeper, significantly deeper than those other people's.
This listener on Discord writes, I'm a bit worried that if this does blow over, it moves the norm for everyone, including his base, on whether institutions can hold the president accountable for his actions. The worst case is everyone gets disillusioned instead of galvanized, empowering him to take even more bold actions. Luke, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, has the public been desensitized to Donald Trump's behavior? Yes. I mean, it's not a new idea that the type of things that the president does would have sunk any other politician's career, right? He routinely acts in ways that almost anyone else, they would have been run out of politics years ago. And in some ways, he's changed a lot of the norms in the country because of that. We now see a president that acts a certain way, and he's the leader of the country, and kids watch him on TV, and people listen to him talk every day. And so he has this sort of, this omnipresent power in many people's lives, in many Americans' lives. And I do think he's changed sort of the culture and the standards and the norms that we've come to expect from a president as Americans.
Let me remind listeners, you're listening to Forum. I'm Mina Kim. Ankush, I'm curious if you think there have been things that have shifted or what the impacts will be of this now collision of conspiracy theories and the executive branch.
Look, nothing good can come out of it. That's what I have to say. I mean, really, there's not going to be a satisfying resolution to this. They're never going to release the information that's been asked of them to release. Under ordinary circumstances, it would be crazy for them to do so because the Justice Department, the FBI, do not go around releasing raw investigative material from closed criminal cases. That's just not the norm. But of course, this is an expectation that Trump and the folks around him created. So that in terms of the downstream effects, I mean, look, there's already some polling, and we don't want to read too much into it, but some polling indicating that Pam Bondi's approval rating has fallen in the weeks that this has been going on. So that remains to be seen in long term. I'd be surprised if she were removed. It doesn't really make much sense because the next attorney general would have the exact same constraints and the exact same conundrums and problems on their hands and conflicts on their hands. So I don't really see a good way that this ends, even if Trump and the administration claim that they're putting out some wide swath of information that quote unquote comprises the quote-unquote Epstein files. First of all, I highly, highly doubt that, given the volume of material that day will ever come. It's an extraordinary volume of material. But second, the problem is I think Trump has burned his public credibility on this point. So I think there will be a subset of people who will say, well, we don't trust him. Of course he wouldn't have released the worst stuff if it concerned him. And again, that is a rhetorical hole that they've dug for themselves in the way that they've approached this issue publicly for the last couple of weeks, with all of the hemming and hawing and the finger pointing and the efforts to push the blame off to other people who had little to nothing to do with any of this.
Let me go to caller Sophie in Castro Valley. Hi, Sophie, you're on.
Hi, thanks for having me on. I'm curious what you think about the idea that Elon Musk is driving this in the news cycle, particularly in the right-wing conspiracy theory sphere. It seems as though the Epstein files issue just came up after Trump and Musk had their falling out. So I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, Luke, do you want to take that? Thanks, Sophie.
He's certainly stoked it on. I don't think he's the only reason, but right after they had their falling out, remember they got in that sort of flame war on Twitter, and he said the real reason Donald Trump won't release the Epstein files is because he's in it. And and all along he's been tweeting and replying to tweets, or X's or whatever they're called now. And so, yeah, he's reveling in this. He's definitely encouraging it and playing it up. And Elon Musk loves a conspiracy theory, and so does much of Twitter. And so the idea that there's these shadowy forces covering up for pedophiles in the federal government is quite a conspiracy theory. Well,
Yes.
I'll also say that there is this is a theory that sort of everyone can get in on, because there's Democrats like Clinton who is associated with Epstein, because there's Trump. Like Democrats, Republicans, everybody in the country can have someone they hate associated with Epstein. And so it really I think that contributes to why this has so much staying power, right? Anybody can project the sort of enemy they wish going to jail in connection with Jeffrey Epstein. And so I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon.
Ankush, what are you watching for? What are the core things that have come out of the many events of these last couple of weeks that you in particular really want to keep an eye on?
Well, look, I think the lawsuit against the Journal is something folks are going to be following very closely to see if it, how far it proceeds, and if it potentially precedes discovery, and if so, what that produces. Obviously, the litigation on the grand jury, testimony, folks will be watching that to see what shakes loose. That could take a couple of weeks. I'm not sure how long it will take the judge to reach a resolution on that. And then sort of on the political side, I'm going to be curious to see whether they can actually withstand pressure to release more. I mean, I think a lot of people hear a grand jury testimony initially, they think, oh, that's the good stuff. And it really, in this context, it's going to be tiny fraction and possibly not even relevant to most people's concerns about other parties. And if they can hold the line on this, like that they're only pursuing these very narrow avenues, then, that's a political boon to Trump. But if they continue to get more pressure, that's the thing I'm sort of looking for, to see if his supporters sort of really take this on and integrate the idea that he is not giving them anything close to what they asked for, or if, sort of as Luke indicated, they sort of start to retrofit the facts to Trump's view of events. I would just want to say, if in the last couple of seconds here, that what we're talking about and the whole mess that has been created is exactly why these people, Trump, the vice president, the FBI director, the attorney general, on and on and on, should never have been trafficking in these conspiracy theories in the first place. This is now consuming the whole country. It's almost as though like they didn't even understand that there were real victims here who might have been traumatized by all this over the years, or now have to relive this yet again for the foreseeable future. It was wildly irresponsible, and I'm ashamed about it. Yeah.
Ankush Khardori of Politico, former federal prosecutor, Luke Broadwater, White House reporter for the New York Times. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Caroline Smith, for producing this. And thanks always to our listeners. This is Forum. I'm Mina Kim.